The Montana blizzard showed no mercy to anyone caught in its frozen grip. But for Sarah Coleman, 8 months pregnant and desperately alone, this storm would become more than just a fight for survival. It would become the moment that changed everything. Picture this: a woman who'd already lost her husband to a rattlesnake bite, now facing the brutal Montana winter with nothing but hope and the child growing inside her. The bank was coming for her land. Her sister's letter offering help was months old, and now she was lost in the worst blizzard the territory had seen in decades. This is the story of two broken souls finding each other in the most impossible circumstances. A pregnant widow who thought her story was ending, and a mysterious stranger whose own past had taught him that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to let someone die alone. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the power of human compassion in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about the moments that define us, the choices that change everything, and the unexpected ways that love can bloom even in the harshest wilderness. So settle in, because this story will take you from the edge of despair to the warmth of hope, from a woman's darkest hour to the dawn of a new beginning that neither she nor the man who saved her could have ever imagined. Some say there are no coincidences in life, only miracles disguised as chance encounters. Others believe that when we're at our lowest point, the universe has a way of sending exactly what we need, even if it comes in the form we least expect. Sarah Coleman was about to discover which of these truths would prove stronger than the Montana blizzard that threatened to claim both her life and her unborn child's. But first, she had to survive the next few hours. And survival, as she was about to learn, sometimes requires us to trust a complete stranger with everything we hold dear. The wind screamed across the Montana territory like a banshee, driving snow so thick and fast that Sarah Coleman could barely see her horse's ears twitching ahead of her. The mare stumbled again, her hooves struggling for purchase in snow that had drifted waist-deep in places. Sarah gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her pregnant belly making it impossible to maintain proper balance as the horse lurched through another drift. 8 months along and alone in the wilderness? It was madness, and Sarah knew it. But what choice had she been given? The bank notice had been crystal clear: pay the outstanding debt on the homestead within 30 days or face foreclosure. With Thomas dead these past 4 months, struck down by a rattlesnake while checking the north fence line, Sarah had no way to work the land herself, no income, and no hope of making the payment. The only lifeline she had was a letter from her sister Margaret, written 6 months ago from Silver Creek, promising help if Sarah ever needed it. 6 months was a lifetime in the territories, and people's circumstances could change overnight. But it was the only hope Sarah had left. She'd packed what little she could carry: some clothes, the last of their savings sewn into her coat lining, and Thomas's father's Bible. Everything else she'd left behind: the house where she'd planned to raise her children, the barn where Thomas had taught her to milk cows, the garden where she'd imagined growing old. All of it would belong to the bank soon enough. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the cold that seeped through every layer of clothing Sarah wore. She pressed a mittened hand to her belly, trying to offer comfort to the child who would be born into a world without a father, possibly without a home. "I know, little one," she murmured, her breath forming crystals in the frigid air. "Mama's doing the best she can." But her best was starting to feel woefully inadequate. The trail to Silver Creek had disappeared entirely under the accumulating snow, and Sarah hadn't seen any landmarks she recognized for hours. Her horse, a reliable mare named Honey, who'd belonged to Thomas, was beginning to flag. The animal's breathing had become labored, and Sarah could feel the tremor of exhaustion in the horse's gait. Worse still, the contractions had started. At first, Sarah had dismissed them as the usual discomfort of late pregnancy, the tightening and releasing she'd felt for weeks as her body prepared for birth. But they were coming more regularly now, and with increasing intensity. A sharp pain gripped her lower back and wrapped around her belly like a band of iron, making her gasp and lean forward in the saddle. "Not now," she whispered desperately. "Please, not now." But nature doesn't negotiate with human desperation. The contractions were real, and they were getting stronger. Sarah tried to calculate how far apart they were, but time seemed to move differently in the storm. Minutes could feel like hours when you were fighting for every breath against the wind. The snow was falling harder now, if such a thing were possible. Each flake was like a tiny dagger of ice, stinging her face and finding its way into every gap in her clothing. Her fingers had gone numb inside her mittens hours ago, and she could no longer feel her toes at all. The cold was becoming more than discomfort. It was becoming dangerous. Honey stumbled again, this time nearly going down on her front knees. Sarah felt the horse's strength failing beneath her, and panic began to claw at her chest. If the horse collapsed, they would both die out here. Her baby would die with them, never having drawn a single breath of life. That's when she saw it, or thought she did. Through the swirling white curtain of snow, she caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong to the wilderness. A straight line that nature rarely produced. Her heart leaped with desperate hope. "Come on, honey," she urged, turning the mare toward what she prayed was shelter. "Just a little farther." But Honey had reached her limit. As they crested a small rise, the horse's front legs buckled. Sarah felt herself sliding sideways, her pregnant belly making her top heavy and unable to correct her balance. She hit the ground hard, rolling sideways into a deep snowdrift that cushioned her fall, but immediately began soaking through her clothes with icy moisture. For a moment she lay still, catching her breath and taking inventory of her body. Nothing seemed broken, but the baby was moving frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger they were in. Honey had managed to stay upright, but the horse stood with her head hanging low, sides heaving with exhaustion. Sarah struggled to her feet, snow falling from her coat in heavy chunks. That's when she saw it clearly. Not just a straight line, but the corner of a building, a cabin, weathered but solid, with smoke rising from its chimney like a banner of hope against the gray sky. Another contraction gripped her then, stronger than any before. Sarah doubled over, crying out despite herself. The pain was unmistakable now, labor pains, coming fast and hard. Her baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. Fighting through the contraction, Sarah took Honey's reins and began struggling through the snow toward the cabin. Each step was agony, her swollen body awkward and unwieldy, the snow reaching past her knees in places. Behind her, she could hear Honey's labored breathing, but the horse was following. 50 yards, 40, 30. Another contraction struck, so powerful it brought Sarah to her knees in the snow. She knelt there, gasping and shaking, as the reality of her situation crashed over her like an avalanche. She was going into labor in a blizzard, miles from any doctor or midwife, completely alone except for an exhausted horse. But she wasn't completely alone, was she? Someone lived in that cabin, someone who'd kept a fire burning and might have room for a desperate woman and her unborn child. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled herself upright again and covered the last yards to the cabin door. The structure was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Not just a shelter, but a real home. Warm light glowed from windows, and the sound of splitting wood came from somewhere nearby. Sarah raised her fist and pounded on the heavy wooden door, putting all her remaining strength into the sound. "Help!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please, someone help me!" The sound of wood splitting stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached from inside the cabin. Heavy measured steps that spoke of a large man moving with purpose. Sarah held her breath, praying that whoever lived here was the kind of person who would help a stranger in distress. The door swung open, and Sarah found herself looking up at one of the largest men she'd ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that filled the doorway and arms like tree trunks. His hair was dark and longish, his beard full and streaked with premature gray. But it was his eyes that struck her most, deep blue and kind, with the look of someone who'd seen hardship but hadn't let it turn him cruel. Those eyes took in her condition in a single glance. The pregnant belly, the snow-soaked clothes, the exhausted horse standing behind her in the storm. "Dear God," he breathed, and without another word, he stepped forward and swept Sarah up in his arms as if she weighed no more than a child. The warmth hit Sarah like a physical force as the stranger carried her into his cabin. After hours in the bitter cold, the heat from the stone fireplace felt almost overwhelming, making her skin tingle and her eyes water. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the sudden change, and found herself looking around a space that was both rustic and surprisingly comfortable. The cabin was larger inside than it had appeared from outside, One main room with a kitchen area, a sleeping alcove, and several handmade chairs arranged around the fireplace. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, tools, and what looked like medical supplies. Everything was clean and well organized, suggesting a man who valued order in his solitary life. "Set me down," Sarah managed to say, though her voice was shaky. "I can walk." The stranger, she still didn't know his name, carefully lowered her to her feet near the fire. "Ma'am, I'm Jacob Whitmore. This is my home, and you're safe here." His voice was deep and steady, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "What's your name?" "Sarah Coleman," she replied, then gasped as another contraction began building. She gripped the back of a wooden chair, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. Jacob's eyes widened as he recognized what was happening. "Mrs. Coleman, are you—" "In labor," Sarah finished through gritted teeth. "The baby's coming." Without hesitation, Jacob moved into action. He grabbed a thick blanket from a trunk near the sleeping alcove and spread it on the floor near the fire. "I've delivered calves and foals," he said matter-of-factly, as if this were a perfectly normal situation. "Can't imagine it's too different." Despite her pain and fear, Sarah almost smiled. "I hope you're right." Jacob helped her out of her snow-soaked coat and boots, his movements efficient but respectful. He brought her dry clothes, a large flannel shirt that belonged to him, and thick wool socks that reached nearly to her knees. "There's a screen over there for privacy," he said, nodding toward a folding screen in the corner. "I'll tend to your horse while you change." "Honey," Sarah said. "Her name is Honey." "Honey it is. I'll take good care of her." As Jacob stepped outside into the storm, Sarah marveled at her strange fortune. Of all the cabins she might have stumbled upon in the wilderness, she'd found one belonging to a man who seemed both capable and kind. She changed quickly into the dry clothes, grateful for their warmth, even though they hung on her like sacks. Jacob returned a few minutes later, stamping snow from his boots. "Honey's in my barn with my mules," he reported. "Fed and warm. She's a good horse, just exhausted." Another contraction gripped Sarah then, stronger than any before. She doubled over, crying out despite her efforts to stay quiet. Jacob was beside her in an instant, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her to the blanket he'd prepared. "How far apart are they coming?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. Sarah tried to think through the pain. "Every few minutes, I think. They're getting stronger." Jacob nodded grimly. "We need to get you comfortable and see how far along you are." He moved to his shelves and began gathering supplies: clean towels, a basin for water, scissors, what looked like medicinal herbs. "I should tell you, Mrs. Coleman, I was a field medic during the war, delivered more than a few babies when the doctors were busy with the wounded." This information should have been reassuring, but Sarah found herself wondering about this solitary man who lived alone in the wilderness, yet kept medical supplies and delivered babies with calm competence. Who was Jacob Whitmore, and what had brought him to this isolated place? Before she could ask, another contraction overwhelmed her ability to think about anything else. This one lasted longer and felt different, more purposeful, as if her body was finally committed to bringing her child into the world. "That's it," Jacob said quietly, washing his hands in a basin of warm water. "Your baby's decided it's time." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain, exhaustion, and the steady presence of this stranger who'd become her unlikely midwife. Jacob proved to be exactly what she needed: calm when she panicked, encouraging when she wanted to give up, and knowledgeable enough to guide her through the process with confidence. "I can see the head," he announced during one particularly intense contraction. "Your baby has dark hair just like yours." Sarah laughed through her tears, amazed that she could feel joy in the midst of such pain. "Thomas had dark hair too," she gasped. "This little one's going to be beautiful," Jacob said softly. "One more push, Mrs. Coleman. Your baby's almost here." With a final, overwhelming surge of effort, Sarah felt her child slip free into the world. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard filled the cabin: the lusty cry of a healthy newborn. "It's a girl," Jacob announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little girl." Through her exhaustion, Sarah watched as Jacob carefully cleaned her daughter and wrapped her in soft blankets he'd warmed by the fire. When he placed the baby in her arms, Sarah felt as if her heart might burst from the overwhelming love that flooded through her. "Hello, sweet girl," she whispered, studying the tiny face that was indeed perfect, small and red and wrinkled, with dark hair that curled damply against her scalp. "I'm your mama." The baby's eyes opened briefly, and Sarah could swear she saw Thomas in that fleeting gaze. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that while she'd lost her husband, she'd gained this precious piece of him that would be with her always. "She's beautiful," Jacob said quietly, kneeling beside them. "What will you name her?" Sarah had thought about names for months, but looking at her daughter now, only one seemed right. "Hope," she said firmly. "Her name is Hope." Jacob smiled for the first time since she'd arrived, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Hope Coleman. I like that very much." As if responding to her name, baby Hope made a small sound and turned her head toward Sarah's voice. The simple movement filled Sarah with such fierce protectiveness that she understood, perhaps for the first time, what mothers throughout history had been willing to die for. "Thank you," Sarah said to Jacob, meaning it more than any words she'd ever spoken. "You saved both our lives tonight." Jacob's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Coleman, you can't travel for at least a week, maybe 2. The storm's still raging, and you need time to recover." Sarah looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Jacob said firmly. "This cabin's been too quiet for too long. Maybe it's time it heard a baby's laughter again." There was something in his voice, a hint of old sadness that made Sarah wonder what losses had brought Jacob Whitmore to this solitary life. But those were questions for another day. For now it was enough that he'd offered them shelter and safety. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, warmth reigned. Sarah held her daughter close, listening to Jacob move quietly around the room, banking the fire and preparing food. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. Hope stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that newborns make. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered a promise. "We're going to be all right, little one. Somehow, we're going to be just fine." Dawn came slowly to the Montana wilderness, filtered through clouds heavy with snow that continued to fall steadily against the cabin windows. Sarah woke to the sound of Hope's soft crying and the gentle crackle of a fire that someone had already stoked to warm brightness. For a moment, she felt disoriented. The events of the previous night seemed almost like a dream, but the weight of her daughter in her arms was wonderfully real, and the soreness in her body reminded her that Hope's birth had been no dream at all. Sarah shifted carefully on the makeshift bed Jacob had prepared for her near the fireplace, marveling at how perfectly her daughter fit in the curve of her arm. "Good morning," came Jacob's quiet voice from the kitchen area. "How are you feeling?" Sarah looked up to see him approaching with a steaming cup of what smelled like coffee mixed with something medicinal. He'd already been up for some time, judging by the fact that he was fully dressed and the cabin was warm and tidy. "Sore," Sarah admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "But alive, thanks to you." Jacob's expression grew serious. "You both are stronger than you know. What you did last night?" He shook his head in wonder. "I've seen grown men give up with less cause." Sarah sipped the warm drink, surprised by its pleasant taste despite the medicinal herbs. "What is this?" "Willow bark tea with some other herbs that will help with pain and healing," Jacob explained. "My grandmother's recipe. She was what folks politely called a root woman, knew more about healing than most doctors." "Where did you learn so much about childbirth?" Sarah asked, studying his face in the morning light. He looked younger than she'd initially thought, probably only in his mid-30s, but his eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen more than his share of life's hardships. Jacob's hands stilled on the coffee pot he'd been reaching for. "I was married once," he said quietly. "My wife Elizabeth went through 3 difficult births. Lost the first 2 babies, but the third—" His voice trailed off, and Sarah saw pain flicker across his features. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have pried." "It's all right," Jacob replied, though his voice remained subdued. "It was a long time ago. Elizabeth died in childbirth, along with our son. That was 8 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding of loss. Sarah found herself looking at this man who'd saved her life with new eyes. No wonder he lived alone in the wilderness. He was running from ghosts just as she was. Hope stirred in her arms, making small mewing sounds that indicated she was ready to eat. Sarah adjusted her position, grateful for the privacy screen Jacob had thoughtfully positioned nearby. "I should check on the animals," Jacob said, understanding her need for privacy without her having to ask. "The storm's still blowing, but it's not as fierce as last night." After he'd stepped outside, Sarah settled into feeding her daughter, marveling at how naturally the baby took to nursing. Hope's tiny fingers curled around Sarah's finger with surprising strength, and her dark eyes, when they opened, seemed to study her mother's face with infant curiosity. "You're perfect," Sarah whispered to her daughter. "Your daddy would have loved you so much." The thought of Thomas brought the familiar ache of grief, but it was tempered now by the joy of holding his child. Hope was a living reminder that love could create something beautiful, even in the midst of loss. Jacob returned a short while later, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat near the door. "Honey's doing well," he reported. "Ate a good breakfast and seems to have recovered from yesterday's ordeal." "That's more than I can say for myself," Sarah said with a weak smile. "I feel like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle." "That's normal," Jacob assured her, moving to the stove to prepare what smelled like breakfast. "You'll be weak for several days. Your body's been through a tremendous ordeal." As Jacob cooked, Sarah found herself observing the easy efficiency of his movements. Everything in the cabin had its place, and he moved through his morning routine with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to taking care of himself. Yet there was something lonely about it too, the careful order of a life lived in solitude. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah began hesitantly. "Jacob, please. I think we're past formal courtesy after last night." "Jacob, then, I need to ask, what will you do when the storm passes? About us, I mean." Jacob set down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir what looked like porridge. "What do you mean? I have no money to pay you for your help. My horse is in no condition to travel far, and she gestured helplessly at Hope. "I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Where were you trying to get to when the storm caught you?" "Silver Creek. My sister Margaret lives there, or did 6 months ago when she wrote to me. She offered to help if I ever needed it, but 6 months is a long time in the territories," Jacob finished. "People move on, circumstances change." "Exactly. And even if she's still there, I have no way of knowing if her offer still stands. She might have a husband now, children of her own. She might not be able to take in a sister and a baby." Jacob ladled porridge into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a spoon and a cup of fresh coffee. "Silver Creek is about 40 miles northeast of here," he said thoughtfully. "Under normal conditions, it's a 2-day ride. But with a new baby and winter weather, it might as well be 1,000 miles, Sarah said despairingly. "Not necessarily." Jacob sat down in the chair across from her makeshift bed. "Mrs. Coleman, Sarah, I have a proposition for you." Sarah looked up from her porridge, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "I make trips to Silver Creek every few months for supplies and to trade furs. I was planning to go in about 3 weeks, once this storm system passes and the weather settles. You and Hope could travel with me then, when you're stronger and the conditions are safer." Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but then reality intruded. "I still can't pay you anything for your trouble." "I'm not asking for payment," Jacob said firmly. "I'm asking for something else entirely." "What?" Jacob looked down at his hands, seeming to struggle with his words. "This cabin's been empty of life for 8 years. Oh, I've survived well enough, but surviving isn't the same as living. Last night, when I heard Hope cry for the first time..." He paused, his voice growing thick. It sounded like hope itself had come back to this place. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the emotion in his voice. "What I'm asking," Jacob continued, "is that you stay here until you're strong enough to travel. Let me hear her laugh, watch her learn to focus on faces, see what it's like to have a family in this house again, even if it's only temporary." The offer was so generous, so unexpected, that Sarah felt overwhelmed. "You don't even know me," she protested. "I could be a terrible person, a criminal on the run, anything." Jacob smiled then, the expression lighting up his entire face. A terrible person doesn't risk her life traveling through a blizzard to avoid being a burden to others. A criminal doesn't worry about imposing on the man who saved her life. You're a good woman, Sarah Coleman, and your daughter is a blessing. All I'm asking is to share in that blessing for a few weeks. Hope chose that moment to make a small sound, not quite a cry, but a definite statement of her presence. Both adults looked down at her, and Sarah saw something in Jacob's face that made her decision easy. "All right," she said softly. "We'll stay until I'm strong enough to travel. But I insist on earning our keep somehow. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. We'll figure it out as we go," Jacob said, but his smile told her how much her acceptance meant to him. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. What had begun as a desperate refuge was becoming something else entirely. A temporary home where two wounded souls might begin to heal, guided by the innocent presence of a baby who had no idea how profoundly she was changing both their lives. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. Despite being strangers thrown together by circumstances, she and Jacob moved around each other in the cabin with an ease that spoke of some deeper compatibility. He would rise early to tend the animals and check his trap lines, returning to find Sarah awake with hope, the baby fed and content in her arms. Jacob proved to be unexpectedly adept at infant care. He'd carved a beautiful wooden cradle within days of Hope's birth, smoothing every surface until it was silk soft to prevent any possible splinters. He sang to the baby while Sarah rested, his deep voice gentle with half-remembered lullabies his grandmother had taught him decades ago. "She likes you," Sarah observed one morning, watching Jacob hold Hope while she prepared breakfast. The baby gazed up at him with the focused attention newborns reserve for faces they're learning to recognize. "The feeling's mutual," Jacob replied, adjusting the blanket around Hope's tiny form. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to hold someone so small, so completely trusting." There was wonder in his voice, but Sarah caught the undercurrent of old pain. She'd learned, through careful questioning over the past week, more about the losses that had driven Jacob to this isolated life. His wife Elizabeth had been pregnant 3 times in their 4-year marriage. The first 2 babies had been stillborn, devastating losses that Elizabeth had blamed on herself, despite Jacob's attempts to convince her otherwise. When Elizabeth conceived for the 3rd time, they'd both been cautiously hopeful. The pregnancy progressed normally until the very end, when labor went on for nearly 2 days without progress. By the time they'd gotten Elizabeth to the nearest doctor, it was too late. Both mother and baby died within hours of each other, leaving Jacob with nothing but grief and a house full of memories he couldn't bear. "I sold everything and headed west," he told Sarah one evening, while they sat by the fire, Hope sleeping peacefully between them. "Figured if I went far enough, maybe I could outrun the pain." "Did it work?" Sarah had asked gently. Jacob had been quiet for a long moment. "The pain's still there," he'd admitted, "but it's different now. Quieter. And having you and Hope here..." He'd trailed off, but Sarah understood. Now watching him cradle her daughter with such natural tenderness, Sarah felt her heart do something complicated and unexpected. She'd loved Thomas with the fierce certainty of youth, but this feeling growing inside her was different, deeper, more mature, tempered by loss and made precious by its very fragility. "Sarah," Jacob said suddenly, breaking into her thoughts, "there's something I need to tell you." The serious tone in his voice made her look up sharply. "What is it?" Jacob settled Hope more securely in his arms before speaking. "Yesterday, when I was checking the north trap line, I saw tracks. Fresh ones heading toward the cabin." Sarah's blood chilled. "What kind of tracks?" "Horses, 3 of them, moving in formation like a search party." Jacob's expression was grim. "I followed them part way, and they definitely came from the direction of your homestead." "The bank," Sarah breathed. "They must have sent men to look for me when I didn't return after the foreclosure notice. That's what I'm thinking. The question is, what do we do about it?" Sarah's mind raced. If the bank's men found her here, they might try to force her to return and face whatever legal consequences came with abandoning the property. At best, she'd lose any chance of claiming her few remaining possessions. At worst, they might try to separate her from Hope, claiming she was an unfit mother who'd endangered her child by traveling in a blizzard. "How close did they come?" she asked. "Close enough to see the cabin, but the storm probably covered any sign that we're here. The smoke from the chimney would have been invisible in that snow." "But they'll be back." "Probably. Men like that don't give up easily when there's money involved." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. Just when she'd begun to feel safe, to hope that she and Hope might have a chance at a new life, the past was reaching out to drag them back. "Hey," Jacob said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. "We'll figure this out. I won't let anyone hurt you or Hope." The simple statement, spoken with such quiet conviction, steadied Sarah's nerves. "What can we do?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through their options. "First, we need to know more about what we're dealing with. I'll ride out tomorrow and see if I can pick up their trail, figure out where they went and whether they're planning to come back. That could be dangerous." "I know this country better than they do," Jacob replied confidently. "I can track them without being seen." "And if they are planning to come back?" Jacob's expression grew hard. "Then we'll be ready for them." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm finally having blown itself out. Jacob prepared to leave early, checking his rifle and packing supplies for what might be a long day of tracking. "Stay inside as much as possible," he instructed Sarah. "Keep the curtains drawn and the fire low so there's minimal smoke. If anyone comes while I'm gone, don't answer the door." "What if it's you returning?" "I'll call out so you know it's me. Anyone else, you hide with Hope until they leave." Sarah nodded, though the thought of being alone with her baby while potentially dangerous men might be nearby terrified her. Still, she trusted Jacob's judgment. In the short time she'd known him, he'd proven himself to be both capable and careful. Jacob paused at the door, looking back at her in hope. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "Be careful," Sarah replied, surprised by how much she meant it. After Jacob left, the cabin felt unnaturally quiet. Sarah tried to occupy herself with mundane tasks, mending a tear in Hope's blanket, organizing the medical supplies Jacob had used during the birth, preparing soup for their evening meal, but her ears were constantly tuned for the sound of approaching horses. Hope seemed to sense her mother's tension. The baby was fussier than usual, crying more and sleeping less. Sarah found herself pacing the cabin, bouncing Hope gently and humming the lullabies Jacob had taught her. It was nearly noon when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Sarah's heart began to pound as she quickly moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 men on horseback were riding directly toward the cabin. Even from a distance, she could see they were well armed and moved with the purposeful confidence of men on official business. These had to be the bank's men Jacob had tracked. Sarah grabbed Hope and moved quickly to the back of the cabin, where Jacob had shown her a hiding place behind a false wall he'd built to store supplies. It was cramped and dark, but it would conceal them completely. As she settled into the hiding space with Hope pressed against her chest, Sarah heard the horses stop outside the cabin. Heavy footsteps approached the door, followed by loud, authoritative knocking. "Mrs. Coleman!" a man's voice called out. "We know you're in there. Open the door." Sarah held her breath, praying Hope would stay quiet. The baby seemed to sense the danger, remaining unusually still in her arms. "Mrs. Coleman, this is Deputy Marshal Harrison. You're not in trouble, but we need to speak with you about the Coleman homestead and your legal obligations." More knocking, harder this time. "We're not leaving until we talk to you, ma'am. We know you're here. We tracked your horse to this location." Sarah's heart sank. They must have followed Honey's trail from where she'd collapsed in the snow. Even Jacob's barn couldn't hide that evidence. The knocking stopped, and Sarah heard muffled conversation outside. Then came the sound she'd been dreading, the cabin door being forced open. Heavy footsteps entered the cabin, and Sarah heard the men moving around, searching. One of them commented on the baby clothes and supplies scattered around, confirming they knew she was there. "She's here somewhere," one man said. "Place is too lived in for her to be gone long." "Check every corner," another voice ordered, "and be thorough about it." Sarah closed her eyes and held Hope tighter, praying Jacob's hiding place would keep them safe. Outside their concealment, she could hear the men systematically searching the cabin, getting closer to where she hid. Just when she thought they would surely be discovered, Another sound reached her ears. Jacob's voice, loud and commanding, coming from outside the cabin. "You men are trespassing on my property. I suggest you leave immediately." Jacob's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who wouldn't be easily intimidated. From her hiding place, Sarah heard the footsteps in the cabin halt abruptly. Through the thin wall, she could make out muffled conversation as the men moved toward the door to confront Jacob. "This is Deputy Marshal Harrison," came the voice that had been calling for her earlier. "We're conducting official business here." "Official business that involves breaking into my home?" Jacob's tone was dangerously calm. "I don't see any warrant. We're looking for Mrs. Sarah Coleman. We have reason to believe she's taken refuge here." "Do you now?" Jacob replied, and Sarah could hear the slight amusement in his voice. "And what makes you think that?" "We tracked her horse here after the storm. A brown mare, showed signs of hard travel and exhaustion." "Ah, you mean Honey?" Jacob's voice grew closer as he apparently entered the cabin. "Found her wandering in the storm 3 days ago, nearly dead from cold and exhaustion. Poor beast was riderless, probably thrown when she spooked at something. I've been nursing her back to health." Sarah held her breath. Jacob was lying smoothly, creating a plausible story that didn't involve her presence. "If the horse was riderless, where's the rider?" This was a new voice, younger and more aggressive than the marshal's. "Good question," Jacob replied evenly. "If I had to guess, I'd say whoever was riding her either found other shelter or—" He let the implication hang in the air. "We need to search this cabin thoroughly," Marshal Harrison said. "No, you don't." Jacob's voice hardened. "This is my property, and without a warrant, you have no legal right to search anything. You've already committed breaking and entering by forcing my door. We're pursuing a fugitive. A pregnant woman who failed to respond to a foreclosure notice is hardly a dangerous fugitive," Jacob interrupted. "And even if she were, that doesn't give you the right to violate my property rights." There was a tense silence, and Sarah could practically feel the standoff taking place just feet from where she hid. Hope stirred slightly in her arms, and Sarah gently rocked her, praying the baby would remain quiet. "Look, Mr. Marshal Harrison's tone became more diplomatic. "Whitmore." Jacob Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, we're not trying to cause trouble for Mrs. Coleman. The bank just wants to settle the matter of the homestead legally. If she's here, if you're helping her, we can work something out." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Let me ask you something, Marshal. What exactly does the bank plan to do with Mrs. Coleman if you find her?" "Well, there are legal matters to resolve regarding the property abandonment." "She's a widow with a newborn baby," Jacob said quietly. "Her husband died leaving debts she couldn't pay. What legal matters could possibly be more important than letting that woman start over somewhere safe?" "It's not about what's right, Mr. Whitmore. It's about the law." "The law says you need a warrant to search my property," Jacob countered. "The law says a man's home is his castle. The law says a lot of things, Marshal, but it doesn't say you get to terrorize a woman who's lost everything." Another long silence followed. Sarah could hear movement, boots shifting on wooden floors, the creak of leather as men adjusted their positions. "We'll be back," the younger voice said finally, "with a warrant if necessary." "You do that," Jacob replied calmly. "But make sure it's a legal warrant, properly signed by a judge who understands the situation. And next time, try knocking before you break down my door." Sarah heard footsteps moving toward the door. Then the marshal's voice again. "Mr. Whitmore, if you are helping Mrs. Coleman, you should know that interfering with the execution of legal obligations can have serious consequences. And you should know, Marshal, that a man protecting an innocent woman and child is following a higher law than anything the bank might claim." The footsteps receded, and Sarah heard the sound of horses being mounted. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely did Jacob call out softly, "Sarah, it's safe now." Sarah pushed open the concealment panel and emerged from the hiding place. Hope still clutched protectively in her arms. Her legs were shaky from crouching in the cramped space, but relief flooded through her at the sight of Jacob's reassuring presence. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked immediately, moving to help steady her. "Yes, thanks to you," Sarah replied, her voice unsteady. "Jacob, what you did just now, lying to protect us." I didn't lie, Jacob said with a slight smile. I found Honey wandering in the storm, and I have been nursing her back to health. I just didn't mention that I found her with you. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling back. A technicality. The best kind, Jacob agreed. But Sarah, we need to talk about what happens next. They'll be back, probably with more men and legal authority. Sarah sank into one of the chairs by the fire, suddenly exhausted. I know, and I can't keep putting you in danger like this. Maybe I should just go with them, face whatever consequences. Absolutely not, Jacob said firmly. You haven't done anything wrong. Running from debts you can't pay isn't a crime, and traveling with a newborn baby isn't child endangerment. It's survival. But they'll keep coming back. Let them. Jacob moved to the window and peered out at the late afternoon sky. Sarah, I've been thinking about this ever since I saw those tracks yesterday. There might be another solution. What do you mean? Jacob turned back to face her, his expression serious but determined. Marry me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What? Hear me out, Jacob said quickly, moving to kneel beside her chair. As my wife, you'd have legal protection. Your debts would become mine, and I have more than enough money saved to pay off the Coleman homestead. The bank couldn't touch you. Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed. Jacob, you can't be serious. We barely know each other. I know you're brave, kind, and stronger than you realize, Jacob said quietly. I know you're a good mother, and that hope lights up when she sees me. I know that having you both here has made me feel alive again for the first time in 8 years. But marriage, Sarah shook her head. That's not something you enter into lightly, especially not for legal protection. Jacob was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes studying her face. Sarah, can I tell you something? She nodded, not trusting her voice. When I carried you into this cabin that night, when I helped bring hope into the world, something inside me that had been dead for 8 years came back to life. Maybe it's too soon to call it love, but it's something real and strong and worth protecting. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Jacob, I'm not asking you to love me, he continued. I'm asking you to give us a chance to see what this could become. A marriage in name at first, if that's what you need. But a real partnership, a real family. Hope chose that moment to make a small sound, and both adults looked down at her. The baby's dark eyes were open, and she seemed to be studying both their faces with the serious attention newborns sometimes display. She needs a father, Jacob said softly. And I need to be needed again. Sarah looked into Jacob's face and saw the man who'd saved her life, delivered her baby, protected them from the marshal's men, and carved a cradle with his own hands just to make Hope comfortable. She saw kindness, strength, and a loneliness that matched her own. If I said yes, she said carefully, what would that mean? Practically speaking, it would mean you and Hope would be safe. It would mean we'd build a life together here, or wherever you wanted to go. It would mean Hope would grow up with a father who already loves her, and you'd have a partner who respects and cares for you. And if we're not compatible, if this doesn't work, Jacob's expression grew solemn, then we'd figure it out like any married couple does. But Sarah, I have a feeling about this, about us. I think we could be happy together. Sarah looked around the cabin that had become a sanctuary, then down at Hope, who would need stability and protection in the uncertain world they faced. Finally, she looked back at Jacob, this unexpected man who'd become so important to both of them in such a short time. All right, she said quietly. Yes, I'll marry you. Jacob's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Really? Really? But Jacob, I need you to understand. I care deeply for Thomas, and that's not something I can just set aside. I wouldn't want you to, Jacob replied gently. Thomas gave you hope, and for that alone, I'll always honor his memory. But Sarah, we don't have to choose between remembering the past and building a future. We can do both. Hope made another small sound, almost as if she approved of the decision. Sarah laughed despite the emotional weight of the moment. When? She asked. As soon as possible. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Silver Creek every few weeks. We could travel there when you're strong enough, get married legally, and then we'd truly be a family. Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of hope and terror at the decision she'd just made. It was crazy to marry a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks. But then again, everything about her life had become crazy since Thomas died. At least this particular insanity offered the promise of safety and the chance at happiness. "Jacob," she said, reaching out to take his hand, "I can't promise to love you the way I love Thomas, at least not right away." "I understand," Jacob replied, squeezing her fingers gently. "But Sarah, I can promise to love both you and Hope enough for all of us while you figure out your heart." Outside, the wind picked up again, reminding them that winter wasn't finished with the Montana territory yet. But inside the cabin, beside the warm fire, three people who'd found each other against all odds sat together and began planning a future none of them could have imagined just days before. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Silver Creek, in the small church that served the scattered communities throughout the valley. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Jacob had purchased for her during their brief stay in town, along with a shawl that had belonged to his grandmother. The fabric was soft and worn, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and the weight of generations of women who had worn it on their most important days. Hope, now a month old and growing stronger every day, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms throughout the ceremony. The baby had grown plump and healthy under Jacob's devoted care, her dark hair beginning to curl softly against her scalp, her tiny fingers already showing the strong grip that would serve her well in the frontier life ahead. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, was a kind elderly man with silver hair and gentle eyes who asked no uncomfortable questions about their whirlwind courtship. He'd seen enough frontier marriages born of necessity to understand that love could grow from partnership just as easily as partnership could grow from love. His weathered hands held the worn Bible with reverence as he spoke the ancient words that would bind their lives together. "Marriage," he said in his gravelly voice, "is not just a contract between two people, but a covenant before God and community. It's a promise to stand together through whatever storms may come, to find strength in each other when individual strength fails, and to build something greater than either could achieve alone." Sarah felt the truth of those words settle into her heart as she looked into Jacob's steady blue eyes. This man had already proven his commitment to those principles, even before they'd spoken vows. "Do you, Jacob Whitmore, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Jacob replied, his voice strong and certain as he looked into Sarah's eyes. There was something in his gaze that went beyond mere duty or convenience, a warmth and certainty that made Sarah's heart flutter with hope. "And do you, Sarah Coleman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt but from the sheer weight of the moment. She was binding her life to a man she was still learning to know, trusting him with her future and her daughters. The memory of Thomas flickered through her mind, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the love he'd given her and the strength it had provided to reach this moment. But as she looked into Jacob's steady blue eyes, she felt the same certainty that had guided her to accept his proposal. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the small church with conviction. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride." Jacob leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to Sarah's lips, their first kiss as a married couple, soft and respectful and full of promise. It wasn't the passionate kiss of young lovers, but something deeper and more enduring, a seal on a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. Hope stirred in Sarah's arms as if sensing the significance of the moment, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O of surprise before she settled back into peaceful sleep. As they signed the marriage certificate, Sarah noticed that Jacob had listed his occupation as rancher and landowner and his assets as substantial. The careful script of his handwriting spoke of education and refinement that seemed at odds with his simple mountain dwelling. When they left the church, walking into the bright Montana sunshine as husband and wife, Jacob explained what Sarah had begun to suspect. I wasn't entirely honest about my circumstances, he admitted as they walked toward the general store to purchase supplies for their return journey. His boots echoed on the wooden boardwalk, and Sarah could hear the nervousness in his voice. I've been buying land throughout this valley for the past 8 years. The cabin where we've been staying is just my winter residence. Come spring, I was planning to start building a proper ranch. Sarah stopped walking and stared at him, shifting Hope to her other arm. The baby murmured softly but remained asleep. You're wealthy? Comfortable, Jacob corrected, color rising in his cheeks. I made good investments with the money from selling my farm back east, and I've been careful with my spending. I've been living simply by choice, not necessity. The point is, Sarah, we won't want for anything. You and Hope will be well provided for. Sarah studied his face, seeing embarrassment and something that looked almost like shame. Why didn't you tell me this before? Jacob's expression grew serious, and he took her free hand in both of his. Because I wanted you to marry me for the right reasons. I didn't want you to say yes because you felt you had no other choice financially. I've seen too many marriages built on desperation rather than genuine affection. The honesty in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's heart. And what are the right reasons, Jacob? Because you think we might be able to build something good together. Because you trust me to be a good father to Hope and a good partner to you. Because ... He paused, seeming to struggle with his words, vulnerability clear in his expression. Because you think you might be able to love me someday? Sarah reached out and took his hand, no longer surprised by how natural the gesture felt. His palm was warm and calloused from honest work, steady and strong like the man himself. Jacob Whitmore, I think I'm already halfway there. The smile that spread across Jacob's face was radiant, transforming his entire appearance. Years seemed to fall away from him, revealing the younger man he must have been before grief aged him. Really? Really? You've been nothing but kind, patient, and generous from the moment you found me. You delivered my baby, protected us from those men, and offered to share your life with us. If that's not love, it's certainly the foundation for it. Jacob lifted their joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to Sarah's knuckles, his lips warm against her skin. Then we'll build on that foundation, one day at a time. Their first few months as a married couple unfolded with surprising harmony. Jacob proved to be everything Sarah had hoped for in a husband, patient with her emotional ups and downs, devoted to Hope, and committed to making their unconventional family work. He never pushed for more intimacy than she was ready to give, sleeping on a cot near the fire while she and Hope occupied the cabin's single bed. Yet their emotional intimacy grew daily through shared meals, quiet conversations by the fire, and the simple rhythm of domestic life. Jacob had a gift for making the ordinary feel special. He would pick wildflowers for their breakfast table, carve small toys for Hope from scraps of wood, and tell stories in the evenings that made Sarah laugh despite her lingering sadness. Slowly, the cabin began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. As winter gave way to spring, they began making plans for the ranch Jacob had envisioned. The snow melted to reveal rolling hills dotted with early wildflowers, and streams that ran clear and cold from the mountain snowpack. The land he'd purchased included several hundred acres of prime grazing territory and a natural spring that would provide reliable water year-round. We'll build the house on that rise overlooking the valley, Jacob explained one warm afternoon as they walked the property with Hope bundled in Sarah's arms. The baby was alert now, her dark eyes tracking the movement of clouds across the bright blue sky. Big enough for a growing family, with a wide porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. A growing family? Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow at the assumption. Jacob blushed slightly, his hand moving unconsciously to adjust his hat. I mean, if you want more children someday, I know it's too soon to think about that now, but... He trailed off, clearly worried he'd overstepped. Jacob, Sarah interrupted gently, stopping to face him on the sun-warmed hillside. I'd like that. Someday, Hope should have brothers and sisters to grow up with. The relief on Jacob's face was touching. Sarah realized he'd been holding back many of his hopes and dreams, careful not to pressure her into a future she might not want. It was another sign of his consideration, his determination to let their relationship develop naturally. There's something else, Jacob said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. His expression grew serious, and Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. I went to the bank in town yesterday and paid off the Coleman homestead in full. Sarah's breath caught, and she nearly stumbled on the uneven ground. Jacob, you didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said firmly, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. It's your land, Sarah. Your and Hope's inheritance from Thomas. I had it transferred to your name as my wife. It's yours to do with as you choose. Tears filled Sarah's eyes at this unexpected gift. The homestead held too many painful memories for her to ever want to live there again. But knowing it was secure, that Thomas's legacy was protected, meant everything to her. It was another example of Jacob's thoughtfulness, his understanding of what truly mattered to her. I'd like to sell it, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Use the money to help build our ranch. Our ranch, Jacob repeated, and Sarah could hear the happiness in his voice, the joy of finally being able to speak of shared dreams and common goals. As spring turned to summer, their new home began to take shape. Jacob hired men from town to help with the construction, skilled carpenters and stone masons who could create something substantial and lasting. Sarah found herself making decisions about everything from the placement of windows to catch the morning light to the design of the kitchen that would be the heart of their home. It felt strange at first, planning a house with a man who wasn't Thomas. There were moments of guilt, times when she felt she was betraying her first husband's memory by embracing this new life so completely. But gradually those feelings faded, replaced by excitement about the future she and Jacob were creating together. Hope thrived in the mountain air, growing from a tiny newborn into a plump, happy baby who smiled readily and had begun making cooing sounds that Jacob swore were attempts at conversation. She clearly adored her adoptive father, reaching for him whenever he came into view and settling most peacefully in his arms. Jacob, in turn, was completely besotted with her, talking to her constantly as if she were an adult capable of understanding every word. She's going to be spoiled rotten, Sarah observed one evening, watching Jacob show Hope how the leaves on a tree moved in the breeze. The baby's eyes were wide with fascination, and she reached out with chubby fingers to grab at the dancing shadows. A little spoiling never hurt anyone, Jacob replied, lifting Hope high in the air and making her giggle with delight. Especially not a little girl who survived being born in a blizzard. She deserves all the love we can give her. Sarah's heart swelled watching them together. Jacob had taken to fatherhood as if he'd been born for it, patient and gentle, but also playful in ways that brought out Hope's naturally cheerful disposition. The baby had no memory of the desperate circumstances of her birth. To her, this was simply the way the world was supposed to be, safe and warm and full of love. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the temporary porch Jacob had built outside their cabin, Sarah watched him bouncing Hope on his knee while singing a silly song he'd made up about a baby bear who got lost in the woods but found her way home to her family. The sight filled her with such warm contentment that she finally recognized the feeling for what it was. Jacob, she said softly. He looked up from his play with Hope, his hair tousled by the evening breeze and his eyes bright with laughter. In that moment, Sarah saw not the grief-stricken widower who had rescued her from the storm, but the man he was becoming, confident, joyful, fully alive in a way she suspected he hadn't been for years. Yes, I love you. The words hung in the evening air between them, simple and true and long overdue. Jacob's expression grew serious, and he gently passed Hope to Sarah before moving to kneel beside her chair, his hands coming to rest on the wooden arms as he looked up into her face. Say it again, he requested quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I love you, Jacob Whitmore. I love the man you are, the father you've become to Hope, and the future we're building together. I love your kindness, your strength, your patience with my healing heart. I love the way you sing to Hope, the way you make me laugh, the way you see the best in everything around you. Jacob cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a passion they'd both been holding back for months. This kiss was different from their gentle wedding kiss. Deeper, more urgent, full of the desire and affection that had been growing between them through all the quiet moments of their marriage. When they finally broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you too, Sarah Whitmore. More than I ever thought I could love anyone again. You brought light back into my life when I thought it would be dark forever. Hope chose that moment to let out a delighted gurgle, as if she approved of this development in her parents' relationship. Both adults laughed, and Jacob gathered them both into his arms, creating a circle of warmth and contentment that felt absolutely perfect. We're really going to be all right, aren't we? Sarah asked, leaning into her husband's warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and sunshine that always seemed to cling to his clothes. Better than all right, Jacob replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. We're going to be happy. As autumn painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and red, the Whitmore family moved into their new home. It was everything Jacob had promised, spacious and comfortable, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a wraparound porch perfect for watching the sunrise over their valley. The house was built to last, with thick stone walls and sturdy timber beams, but it was also designed for family life, with a large kitchen where they could gather for meals and comfortable rooms where children could play and grow. Sarah established a garden behind the house, planting vegetables and herbs for cooking and healing. She found unexpected joy in working the soil, in nurturing things to life, and watching them flourish under her care. Jacob built up a herd of cattle and horses, employing several local men who appreciated steady work and fair wages. Hope took her first steps in the main room of their new house, tottering between her parents with squeals of delight that echoed off the wooden walls. The house quickly filled with the sounds of family life. Hope's laughter, Sarah's singing as she worked, Jacob's voice calling out greetings as he returned from the fields. It was everything Sarah had dreamed of when she'd married Thomas. The life she'd thought was lost forever when he died. But this was different, richer somehow, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared trials that made every ordinary moment feel precious. On the first anniversary of the night Sarah had collapsed in the snow outside Jacob's cabin, they held a quiet celebration. Hope, now a sturdy toddler with dark curls and bright eyes, played with wooden toys Jacob had carved, while her parents reflected on the year that had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked as they sat by the fire after putting Hope to bed. The question had been weighing on her mind for weeks, born of the natural insecurity that came with such dramatic life changes. "Taking us in, marrying me, changing your whole life?" Jacob reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as he'd done countless times over the past year. His touch was as comforting now as it had been that first night, steady and warm and reassuring. "Sarah, before you and Hope came into my life, I was just surviving, existing day to day without any real purpose or joy. I was marking time, waiting for something I couldn't even name. You two gave me back my life." "You gave us ours too," Sarah replied, squeezing his fingers. "I was so lost after Thomas died, so afraid of the future. You showed me that losing someone doesn't mean you can never love again. It means you understand how precious love is when you find it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace Jacob had built with his own hands. The fire cast warm light over their faces, highlighting the contentment they'd found in this simple domestic scene. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but filled with anticipation. "Jacob, there's something I need to tell you." The serious tone in her voice made him look at her sharply, concern flickering across his features. "What is it? Are you all right?" Sarah smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "Hope's going to be a big sister." Jacob's eyes widened in amazement, his hand pressing gently against the place where their child was growing. "Really? Are you sure?" "Very sure. The baby should arrive sometime in late spring." Jacob let out a whoop of joy that was so loud Sarah had to shush him to avoid waking Hope. Then he gathered his wife into his arms and spun her around the room, both of them laughing like children who just discovered the best secret in the world. When he finally set her down, Jacob's expression grew tender. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" "For giving me a family, for trusting me with your heart, for making me believe in second chances, for choosing to build a future with me instead of just surviving the past." Sarah reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard, seeing the love and wonder in his eyes. "Thank you for finding me in that blizzard, for seeing past my circumstances to the woman I could become, for loving hope as if she were your own blood, for showing me that love isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you choose every day in 100 small ways. She is my own, Jacob replied firmly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd never doubted his love for the child he'd helped bring into the world. Blood doesn't make a family, Sarah. Love does. Choice does. Commitment does. The promise to stand together no matter what storms might come. And we have all three, Sarah said, sealing the truth of her words with a kiss that tasted of promises and hope, and the sweet certainty of a love that had grown strong enough to weather any storm. Outside their warm home, the Montana wind sang through the trees, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But inside, the Whitmore family was safe and strong, bound together by love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. They had proven that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disasters, that hope can be born in the darkest moments, and that love, true love, is not something that happens to you, but something you choose to build, day by day, choice by choice, until it becomes as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. And so, in the unforgiving wilderness of Montana Territory, two broken hearts found healing in each other's arms. Sarah Coleman, who began as a desperate widow lost in a blizzard, became Sarah Whitmore, wife, mother, and partner in building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Jacob Whitmore, who had spent 8 years running from his grief, discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in forgetting the past, but in choosing to embrace a future you never dared to dream possible. Hope, the baby born in a storm, grew up knowing she was wanted and loved by two parents who had chosen each other not from convenience, but from a deeper understanding of what family truly means. She would never lack for anything, not material comfort, not emotional security, and certainly not love. But their story didn't end with their happiness. It was just the beginning of a legacy that would ripple through generations, touching lives in ways they could never have imagined. As the years passed, the Whitmore Ranch became legendary throughout Montana Territory, not for its size or wealth, but for the family that built it and the values they lived by. Travelers caught in storms always found shelter there. Children always found welcome, and love always found a way to flourish in the most unexpected circumstances. Sarah and Jacob went on to have 5 more children together, 3 boys and 2 girls who grew up knowing the story of their parents' miraculous meeting and the sister who had brought them together. Hope became the leader among them, fierce in her protection of her younger siblings and wise beyond her years in ways that spoke to her unique beginning. Each child learned the story of that terrible blizzard night, of how their mother had nearly died bringing hope into the world, and how their father had chosen love over solitude when it would have been easier to turn away. They learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the daily choice to care for each other, to stand together when the world seems against you, to offer shelter to those who have nowhere else to turn. The ranch hands who worked for Jacob spoke of him with rare respect, not just because he paid fair wages and treated them well, but because he remembered what it felt like to be lost and alone. He hired men others wouldn't take a chance on, former soldiers struggling with their memories, young men who'd made mistakes, older cowboys who thought their best days were behind them. Under Jacob's steady guidance, they found purpose and dignity in honest work. Sarah became known throughout the territory as a healer and midwife, the woman to call when births went difficult or when children fell dangerously ill. She never forgot the terror of giving birth alone in a storm, and she made sure no other woman would face such circumstances if she could help it. Her medical bag was always packed, her horse always ready, no matter the weather or the distance. The story of their meeting became folklore, told around campfires and in saloons, in churches and at community gatherings. People called it the Blizzard Miracle, and it gave hope to countless others who found themselves facing impossible circumstances. If a desperate widow and a grieving widower could find love in a Montana snowstorm, then maybe there was hope for anyone. Their love story became proof that the most extraordinary things can grow from the most ordinary acts of human kindness. Jacob could have turned Sarah away that night. He had every reason to want to remain alone with his grief. Sarah could have given up in that storm, could have let despair claim her and her unborn child. Instead, they chose to trust, to hope, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. 25 years after that fateful night, their children had children of their own, and the Whitmore name was synonymous with hospitality, integrity, and the belief that no one should face life's storms alone. Hope married a doctor and continued her mother's healing work, establishing the first proper hospital in Silver Creek. The boys became ranchers and businessmen, each carrying forward their father's example of fair dealing and compassion for those less fortunate. As Jacob and Sarah aged, their love only deepened, tempered by shared trials and sweetened by countless small moments of joy. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Hope had taken her first steps, marveling at the life they'd built from that desperate beginning. "Do you think," Sarah asked one sunset evening, as they watched their youngest grandson chase fireflies, "that we would have found each other if it hadn't been for that storm?" Jacob considered the question seriously, as he always did her thoughtful musings. "I think," he said finally, "that love finds a way. Maybe not that way, maybe not that night, but somehow, some things are just meant to be." Their story reminds us that life's most devastating storms often carry within them the seeds of our greatest blessings, that strangers can become family in the space of a heartbeat, that love is not always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a gentle sunrise, warming hearts that thought they'd never feel warmth again. Sarah never forgot Thomas, the husband who gave her hope and taught her that love was worth the risk of loss. But she learned that the human heart has an infinite capacity for love, that loving someone new doesn't diminish what came before. It honors it by proving that love's greatest power lies not in its exclusivity, but in its ability to multiply and flourish. Jacob proved that a man can be defined not by his losses, but by his choices in the face of those losses. He chose compassion over bitterness, hope over despair, and love over the safety of solitude. In doing so, he discovered that the cure for a broken heart isn't forgetting how to love. It's remembering why love is worth the risk. Their legacy lives on in every act of unexpected kindness, every stranger who offers shelter to someone in need, every person who chooses to see possibility instead of problems when faced with life's storms. Their story proves that sometimes the most precious treasures are discovered not when we're searching for them, but when we're simply trying to survive another day. In a world that can be harsh and unforgiving, Sarah and Jacob's story stands as proof that miracles still happen. Not through magic, but through the courage to open our hearts to the possibility that our greatest happiness might come from the most unexpected places. Their love grew strong and deep, rooted in shared trials and watered by daily choices to cherish what they'd found in each other. And in the end, isn't that what every great love story really is? Not the fairy tale romance of perfect people, but the real-world miracle of imperfect souls choosing to build something beautiful together, one day at a time. What would you have done in Sarah's place that terrible night? Would you have trusted a stranger with your life and the life of your unborn child? And what about Jacob? Would you have opened your door to a desperate woman, knowing it would change everything about the quiet life you'd built? These aren't just questions about a story from the past. They're questions about the choices we all face when life presents us with unexpected opportunities for compassion, for connection, for love. They're about the moments when we can choose to be someone's miracle, or when we can choose to let someone be ours. Sometimes the most precious treasures are discovered not when we're searching for them, but when we're simply trying to survive the storm. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest act of human decency, refusing to let someone face their darkest hour alone. Sarah and Jacob's story lives on, a testament to the power of hope, the strength of love, and the miracle that can happen when two broken hearts choose to heal together. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts about second chances, about the power of kindness, about the moments that changed your life forever. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of courage, love, and hope from America's untamed frontier. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just remind you why the human spirit is capable of such extraordinary things. Until next time, remember, every storm eventually passes, but the love we choose to build in the shelter can last forever.